Thank you, Mr. Smith. Happy Sabbath to you all. Bring you greetings from Cincinnati and tangentially from Southern Ontario, Toronto, where my father pastors. So you have greetings from multiple places. Do you feel greeted? Good. My family and I had an opportunity to visit the family farm. While I was born in Canada, my mom is a U.S. citizen. She was born and raised in the Ozarks of Missouri, and her parents are both still alive. So we had the opportunity to take our kids so they could see great-grandpa and great-grandma and spend some time on the farm. The chickens were a hit, especially the fuzzy baby chicks, freshly sprouted or hatched. The cats, of course, they enjoyed seeing the kids, the cats at least that liked kids, enjoyed seeing them. And it was just nice to relax on the farm. We got to catch some June bugs and tie thread on the legs. Have you done that? Catch June bugs and they fly around. And the hard part, of course, is getting the thread on their leg to begin with. And of course, you take it off and release the bug after a while. So we got to do that again. And just sit on the porch and talk. And as we were on the porch, we got to hear some of Grandpa's stories. The house we were staying in, they'd moved into maybe 20 years previous when my great-grandfather started to ail. So they moved into that farmhouse and began to take care of him. So it was nice to have some of that continuity. And there on the porch was the same chin-up bar that I remember my great-grandfather running to. This would have been in the 80s. He would have been well into his 80s, unpermitted to drive any longer. But he was still spry. He would run across the front yard, hop up onto the step, onto the porch, grab that chin-up bar and skin the cat. Do you know what skin the cat is? There are no cats involved. It's going backwards and doing a gymnastics, you know what I mean? Yeah, skinning the cat. That's what he would do. And of course, we were looking in the car. Some of us who were younger, too young to know any better, were very impressed. And those of us who were old enough to know better were aghast. I can't believe he's doing this. He shouldn't do this. He's too old to do this. He did it anyway and proved us all wrong. But it was in that location we were able to stay and sit on the porch and look out across the county road that went in front of the farmhouse. And as the stories went along over the years, I was able to piece things together. My grandfather knew that house that we were staying in when he was just a boy, sometime in the 20s and 30s. He would walk in front of that farmhouse on his way to school and on the way back from school. He would walk down a couple miles down this gravel road. No, I take that back. He indicated that there was a time when that gravel road didn't have gravel on it. It was bare rock. You've heard of the bald knobbers in Missouri? In his day, there were bald knobs still. Now they're all covered in trees. The gravel road was not a gravel road then. It was bedrock of type. But that's what he would walk down to get to school. In the town of Romance. I'm sure you've heard of it. Romance, Missouri. No, you haven't heard of it. Of course not. It was only popular, even in that day, around the middle of February for some reason. Everybody wanted to get postmarks from Romance for a letter that they would send around February to their special someone. Back in the day, there was a one-room schoolhouse where Grandpa would go to school, as I mentioned. There was a community store, a general store. There was a church, and at one time there was a tomato cannery. There was a grist mill, and for a time there was also a charcoal plant, which ironically burnt down. Not really, it was just abandoned due to immigration issues with some of the workers. But the town has still the building where the church was, and there's still the schoolhouse. When my grandfather went there as a child, there were 80 kids, 80. My mom went to the same one-room schoolhouse. By the time she got there, there were 12. And the community shortly after that closed the school, and everybody went to town, to the county seat, to go to elementary school. And since then, people have moved away. The farms have shuttered up, and these little roads that connect the communities become less and less used as the communities get smaller and smaller. We had the opportunity to drive to a couple other communities and found the same thing. That is where the general store used to be. And over here is where the community center used to be. And in some cases, they were turned into houses. In other cases, they were just abandoned. And it got me thinking about a passage that I'd like to look at today with you together. Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 6. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16. Jeremiah says, "Thus says the Lord." This was not Jeremiah's message. I can't imagine he was anxious to give this message, but he was instructed. "Thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls." But they said, "We will not walk in it." So what I'd like to do today for the remainder of this message is to look at how this passage applies to the United States, to Canada, to the United Kingdom, to Western nations today. Let's look and examine how this passage applies to Western nations today. Let's start with the phrase, "stand in the ways and see." Stand in the ways and see. The first word here is stand. Stand. I've had the opportunity to spend some time in wilderness areas in the western part of the States and Canada and enjoy the wide open spaces. I have an uncle who's from the plains of Saskatchewan. He came to visit us in the mountains one time. Never traveled much, bachelor, and we invited him to stay for a week. He did. He got up early, and we asked him, because he arrived at night, we asked him in the morning, "What do you think of the view?" They're kind of highlands. They're not quite mountains, but they're not hills either. And I always thought they were beautiful. And so we asked my uncle, "What do you think of this beautiful vista?" He said, "The mountain's kind of getting in the way. I can't see anything." I digress. In the West, I enjoyed being in the forest. But it's important when you go into the forest to be prepared for stuff not going the right way, to be prepared for eventualities, to have to spend the night unexpectedly. We had a boat at the time. By we, I mean my dad. And we would have picnics on the boat, and we'd travel to the far side of the lake, the less settled side of the lake, and enjoy a picnic. But there were times weather would blow up and we couldn't make our way back and had to spend longer on the other side than we had normally intended. So we got to get into the habit of having a little extra with us, having a survival guide or a survival pack. And I did some research recently on survival guides. What should a person do if they encounter problems while traveling? What's the first thing to do? And what this particular guide said, remember the acronym STOP, S-T-O-P. S-T-O-P. And that stands for stop, think, observe, and plan. So stop or stand, as we were looking at here in Jeremiah. Stop where you are. If you're lost, don't get loster. Stay still. If you're in a hole, stop digging. So stop. Don't go any farther. And think. The biggest problem about becoming lost is it's too easy for people to become emotional, to panic, to react. That's where the think comes in, and that is to act, to stop and analyze, and to get control of our emotions and to focus on, okay, what do I think of the situation? I think this is a bad situation, yes, but what needs to be done? Observe. Are there storm clouds on the horizon? What should my next action be? Am I going to have to get food next, or am I going to have to get shelter next? And then plan, okay, if I need shelter, what kind of shelter do I need? Do I need to gather wood for a signal fire? So S-T-O-P, stop, think, observe, and plan. Stop. Stand or stop at the crossroads. America, Canada, the United Kingdom are certainly at a crossroads. Did you see the story a couple years back? There was a couple from British Columbia who were driving in their in their passenger van to a trade show, I think it was, in Las Vegas, and they got lost. They didn't have a map. They did, however, have a GPS, the brand of which we won't necessarily mention here. But they relied on their GPS, and the GPS got them lost. It took the mechanics took them down a road that was inappropriate, A, for their vehicle type, and number 2, or B, for the season. They ended up getting stuck in the mud, all the way up to the axles. They could not move this vehicle. So the gentleman, the husband, he decided that what he would do, his name was Albert Chrétien. He decided he was going to go for help. So he took the GPS unit and started hiking. And he made it 7 miles before the weather took him. It was too cold. The GPS unit apparently ran out of power, and so then he started to go off course, and he did not make it. She was missing for days. I believe she was missing for 2-3 weeks. They finally found her. She had written her goodbye note explaining who they were, that her husband was missing for a number of days, had not returned, and she was about to give up because she was out of food, they were out of fuel, the battery was shot. She couldn't go. She couldn't leave. Hunters thankfully found her, rescued her. She did recover, just barely. But they didn't find the husband for, I think it was 1.5 years after. Yeah. A very difficult thing. At a crossroads, it's important to not rely on unreliable objects. The GPS is great. I use it frequently, but have learned that it's important to have a backup map, the paper kind that you don't have to plug in. But I hate putting them away. They never fold up right, at least not immediately. But it's important to have another way of getting through situations. They call this death by GPS. Have you heard that phrase? Death by GPS, really, it's been coined by someone. Don't follow your GPS blindly. So stand at the crossroads. So crossroads is also translated ways. Crossroads. It's been said by politicians in a number of our Western nations, almost with glee, almost with a celebratory note, that we're no longer a Christian nation. In parentheses is hooray, or it's about time. So what are we? If we're no longer a Christian nation, what are we? Just recently built close to where we live in the Eastgate side of Cincinnati is a temple of Southeast Asian origin. The specifics don't really matter. But the point is that what used to be a no-brainer in any community, there was going to be a community church. Well, now there may be a community temple of any variety. And that's if someone has any religious convictions. There are so many who don't. We had the opportunity to spend some time with a neighbor, very nice lady. Very friendly, very hospitable, very giving, very kind, very well-spoken. And in the course of having a conversation with my wife, she explained or lamented, I guess none of us really know why we're here, what we're supposed to be doing. And it really highlighted then the lack of purpose, the lack of accountability, being rudderless, not having a way at all. And she then went on to share how it was comforting to her family after her mother died. And they were together at a family restaurant, and they were coming out of the restaurant having had the meal. And the little child stopped and picked up a penny and showed it to one of the aunts or uncles, and they got all excited because the penny was 1922, the year that the widower was born. So clearly this was a sign from Grandma. Grandma sent this for Grandpa. And what a comfort that was to the family. Of course, believing in this, that's silly superstition. But pennies from heaven, now we're on to something, right? Now, it was not the time to explain to her that that was not the case. But there are many other people who believe along those lines, aren't there? She's not alone. And it may have been even in our history. That was a common belief. But we're at a crossroads. Are we a Christian nation? Kinda. Kind of not. Let's take a look at the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 3. We'll read verses 1 through 3. The word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Verse 2, now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Verse 3, many people shall come and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. I can't help but when I read that, hear the music. Can you? I can't help it. But the same word for crossroads or ways, we will walk in his paths. It's the same word. So stand at the crossroads. Look. Let's turn to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 2. Now, how soon before 5 do I need to quit? Okay, thank you for not throwing hymnals. Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. Now Joshua the son of Nun sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. My grandfather served in the 103rd Cactus Division. He was part of the reconnaissance troop, which for much of the time he spent in a Jeep, learned to sleep in a Jeep. Do you really learn to sleep in a Jeep, or you just learn to rest with your eyes closed in a Jeep? I'm not sure. He learned to survive in a Jeep. One particular occasion, they were towards the end of the war, and he heard an order from the captain. He doesn't have many good things to say about the captain, but the captain demanded volunteers to go into the town and take a house and hold it and then wait for the rest of the troop to come through. The sergeant, whom my grandfather does have many good things to say, said, no, I'm not going to get 2 volunteers. I'm going to volunteer, and I'm going to ask for 1 other volunteer. My grandfather really respected that, so he said, if he's willing to volunteer, I will volunteer too. So they went together. They had to cross through 4 or 5 miles of forest in which there were German troops to get to the town and then find a house. Now, they were told beforehand, there's a field between the forest and the town, and in that field you will find mines. There's a minefield there, so watch your step, which they did. They were able to make it through, get to the minefield. Thankfully, they were anti-tank mines, so they were up above the surface, very plain to see. So they were able to negotiate their way through that minefield, find a house. They busted down the door, both guns drawn, silence, nothing. There was nobody in the house. It took a while to get there. So the sergeant said, look, I will stay behind. You go back and let them know we're here and let them know which house it is. So he did. By the time he got back to the minefield, it was getting close to dark. Those mines were still there, and they're more difficult to see. But thankfully, his eyesight was good enough, or there was a moon out that night. I can't remember the details of the story. But he made it through, got through the forest again, and was stopped by his own outfit. And they were convinced that he was a German spy. He said, look, the captain told us to go through the forest, over the hill, through the woods to grandmother's house, hold it, and send one back. I'm the guy coming back, and I've got to find the rest of the reconnaissance group so we can get back to that house. I don't want to leave the sergeant stranded there all by himself. They didn't believe him. They said, there's no way you could have done what you did because there's too many Germans between us and the town. You must be a spy. I'm not a spy. So this was going back and forth in the headquarters tent. He said, call my captain. He will tell you. We're not going to even do that because you have got to be a spy. Well, my grandfather tends to be, he was described by his sister as keeper of the underdog. He was not going to let this stand, so he slowly wormed his way towards the tent door and said, now look, I am who I say I am, and if you have to shoot me in the back, do it. He jumped out of the tent and into the night. They were able to meet up with the sergeant and found out later that there were actually some German soldiers in the lower floor who were equally as terrified, I'm sure, as the sergeant. They were part of the reconnaissance group. Their job was to find out where enemy forces were, what they were using, and to look very carefully. Crossing that minefield, my grandfather looked very carefully, both ways. Growing up, I had an opportunity to read many Louis L'Amour novels. Have you read Louis L'Amour? I really enjoyed the Sackett series. Most of his books I really enjoyed. And a number of times he brought up a phrase, and that'll come up here in a quote. This is from his autobiography. And he said, he's talking about stories, where he gathered his stories. They're out there by the thousands, wonderful stories. Many have never gotten into the histories, although occasionally told by local newspapers or in privately printed booklets. There are stories of wagon train massacres, buried treasures, gun battles, cattle roundups, border bandit raids. No matter where you go, east, west, north, south, there are stories. People are forever asking me where I get my ideas, but one has only to listen, to look, and to live with awareness. As I've said in several of my stories, all men look, but so few can see. It's all they're waiting for any passerby. Look, stand at the crossroads and look. This is not a casual glance, but this is a study. Not looking intently enough. I think we could argue that is the way society is, far too distracted to really look. The next phrase, ask for the ancient paths. Ask for the ancient paths. Ancient. Let's look at Proverbs 22. Proverbs 22, verse 28. In my Bible, this is in a section of sayings of the wise. Do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. Property markers, or limits, or boundaries. These are ancient markers they're talking about. Same word, ancient. Ask for the ancient paths. These are the ancient landmarks, or the ancient boundaries, or the ancient don't go any further than this. That's what we're talking about. Now, commentaries will point out the ancient paths here, likely talking about the Sinai covenant from Deuteronomy. Ask for the ancient paths. Well, today, what's ancient like? What does ancient mean today in our culture? In our culture that says you need new running shoes each year. Are they running shoes here or tennis shoes? Gym shoes? Tennis shoes? What if you don't play tennis in them? Well, you need new ones every year. Well, have you been to a shoe store lately? And see those shoes? I feel like I'm not qualified to go in because there's so many to choose from, and they look fancy. Some have springs in them and gel pockets, and the worst thing about shoes these days, as I stand on the soapbox, I don't like the mesh on the outsides. I hate the mesh. I'd like to have canvas or leather again so that they don't shred on the side, and then I get grass clippings inside my shoe every time I cut the grass. Does that happen to your feet as well? Why can't they just make a shoe that's solid? I can't find them anymore. Okay, I'm off the soapbox. Shoes are new every year. How about vehicles? because the needs and demands of a minivan change so much from one year to the next. There has to be a new model. We can't have the same van from one year to the next. They've got to have a new one. And it's always improved, right? Never any problems with the new one. Okay, there may be a few. New phones, new gadgets. How long does a phone stay new? They change how many times a month? There's some guys that I work with, and they always have a new phone. I'm just now getting used to this phone and finally understand the functionalities of this phone. I've had it now for almost a year. And I see guys who have a new one every 3 months. Good night. I stay awake for a week trying to get all the accounts moved across and make sure my contacts are there and figure out which one of the buttons is the power button. Such an emphasis on new, isn't there? How much emphasis is there on ancient? Well, your genes are old. Everything has to be new. There's no, or very little at least, respect for ancient anything, let alone ancient paths. But that's what we're told to do here. That's what Jeremiah was warning. Look for the ancient paths. And ask where the good way is. Ask where the good way is. Let's take a look at Job 22, verse 15. Job 22. It's easy to fall into the trap of acknowledging that the present way is not good. The ancient ways are good, all of them. But is that correct? Job 22:15, Job is being challenged. Will you keep the old way which wicked men have trod? So there is a condition here. Ancient ways, yes, but not all ancient ways are good. If we take a look at our nation's history, the history of Western nations, there were a lot of good things. There was a baseline of morality that people were expected to adhere to. You go to church every Sunday. You learn what the preacher says, and you practice those things. Not everything was good, but at least there was a baseline of common civility that used to be part of the fabric of this nation, of Canada, of the United Kingdom. And as churches are abandoned, as communities are shuttered, and churches grow empty, there is no longer that baseline, is there? So what do we fall back upon? Any old way? There are plenty of old ways. And this said, there are some old ways which wicked men have trod, which is the opposite of the Battle Hymn of Republic, which says, what? Where the saints have trod. So there are ancient ways, and there are ancient bad ways too, aren't there? As some of the practices of syncretized holidays show. Ask where the good way is. Let's take a look at John chapter 14. John chapter 14, we'll read verses 5 through 6. Verse 5, Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Verse 6, Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Well, Jesus Christ is the way. All we need is the map, or at least a roadmap to guide us through the way. Are you familiar with the television show? I don't believe it's on anymore. Maybe in syndication, maybe on DVD in your library. Just one season, I think. How the States Got Their Shapes. Have you heard of that show? It's a very interesting show, very informative. And the host, He's excellent. I don't believe the show lasted to a second season, but I know he got another gig somewhere else because his personality is just tremendous. He walked through how each of the states, at least the ones that he talked about, got their individual shapes. Like the boot heel in Missouri, for example, wasn't there originally, but there was a politician who was born in Arkansas in the boot heel, and it was his reckoning that Arkansas would never be as important as Missouri. And so he petitioned then those in D.C. that the county he was born should be part of Missouri, and that's how that little notch got taken out of Arkansas. But there are many such stories, those oddities of the lines in the map. Why is there a panhandle here? Why is Delaware curved on top? And he addresses them. And he brought up a town. The town was founded or incorporated 1791. The town's name is Derby Line, Vermont. Anyone been there? Okay, I'll continue talking about it. Derby Line, Vermont. It borders with Stansted, Quebec. So 1700s, they were mapping out where the line should be through the forest. They didn't have GPS, which we know is unreliable anyway, so the line was not always straight. At this particular part, they drifted past the parallel that was the agreed border, and in fact, demarked this town they thought was in the United States actually wasn't. It was in Quebec, in Canada. However, thanks to a treaty about 50 years later, the government said, okay, yeah, we know that's not the official border, but it is now. In that meantime, however, a town had been established there, on the border, on purpose. And in fact, a couple, I believe one was from Canada, one was from the United States, they deliberately built a house straddling the border and then donated that to the town. It became the town library. So in the middle of this library, and you may have seen this on some travelogues, the middle of this library has a strip of black tape running down it. And on one side is Canada, on one side is the United States. So you can go into the library from either side, cross that line, spend as much time as you want in the other country, but you must leave from the door you entered. You cannot go out the other door. There are many streets that continue from one border to the next, neighbors adjoining them. In fact, there's one street where the house on the southern side of the street is in the United States, but the road itself is in Canada. So the process of driving out of their driveway, they have gone from the United States into Canada, and therefore they have to report to one of the 3 border crossings in this vicinity. Otherwise, some have learned the hard way, if they don't follow these rules, they will get a visit by somebody wearing a very official-looking uniform and explain where they've been and for how long, and learn how much of a problem this is. It was never a problem until 9/11. They've since talked about putting those massive size flower pots in the middle of the road, to act as a barrier, which keeps cars from crossing, but you can still walk between them. So here is a town that is essentially now divided. You can see your neighbor. You might want to take them their newspaper that was delivered to the wrong spot. You can't. But I can see their yard, yet you can't get there from here. This isn't the way to get there. There'll be dire consequences if you try. Christ said he was the way. And Jeremiah said, ask where the good way is. So when a person stops and realizes I'm at a crossroads, I'm headed in the wrong direction, what should I do? Things worked in the past. There used to be communities in these rural farmlands that could support families. What happened? Why are those farms no longer viable? Why did these communities dry up? Why are these schoolhouses now turned into residents? Well, here's a good way. Now what do I do? I found a good way. And walk in it. Walk in it. Let's turn to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel, chapter 17, and we'll read verses 12 through 14. 1 Samuel 17, verse 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years in the day of Saul. Verse 13. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. And the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Follow, same word, walk. The brothers didn't go casually along just to see the battle, as some did in the opening battle of the U.S. Civil War. They knew this wasn't a picnic. They were following to participate, to actively be involved. They were following to be part of that troop, not as hangers-on. They were included in it. Follow the path. It's not good enough to find it. It's not good enough to identify it. It has to be walked in it, as opposed to near it, or close to it, or beside it, or parallel to it. It's not good enough. You have to walk in it. Be submersed in it. As I mentioned before, I like being in the woods. I love walking on trails, especially game trails. There are some woods close to the office that we are able to walk in, and there's some well-marked trails. And I have a hard time staying on trails. I don't know what it is. But when I walk on the trails, I want to know, okay, what's over this little ridge that we can't see from this trail? What's over there? Or what's down by the creek here where the trail doesn't go? I'm ever curious to find out what else is in those woods. And there have been times where I found some interesting critters or old homesteads. Other times I've found thickets of poison ivy. Not as much fun to find. Pawpaw groves, found those. Found some old barbed wire. Not as much fun to find that. But I enjoy finding what else is there, not just what's on the trail. But that is something that's being warned against here. Walk in it. Going off trail is a hazard. Once you have found the way, going off trail is a big hazard. Say, don't do it. Stay on the trail. And you will find rest for your souls. And you will find rest for your souls. The word here that I'd like to focus on is find. Can you find something you haven't lost? No. Well, someone else might find it for you, but it cannot be found unless it's been lost. And here, something has been lost. Do you remember the story about the pocket watch in the ice house? I like the story. I'll tell it again. I hope I don't butcher it for you if you've heard it before. In the old days, or olden days, which sounds better? I'm not sure. There was no refrigeration. Maybe at some of our houses in our recent past. And so food was kept cold using blocks of ice in the ice box. And the ice was gathered from lakes or streams, rivers in the wintertime. They were cut, hauled, and put into the ice house. The ice was put in blocks, and it was packed with sawdust. The walls maybe were shorter so that heat wouldn't collect on the top. It was well insulated from the outside. Maybe canvas tarps were put over top of each layer. And that is how the ice was stored in the wintertime and then released in the summertime when refrigeration was required, when ice cream could be made. Who wants ice cream in January? No one. But July, now you've got something. And so then as the blocks were being pulled out one summer, one of the workmen contributing to the process started to look panicked. And the boys who were congregating close to the stream noticed this, that things were not quite right. Work had stopped, and the men were going into the house and coming out again looking very puzzled, perplexed. One particularly was looking anxious because he had lost his grandfather's pocket watch. That was back before we had 3 devices on us at any time that had the time. The pocket watch was important. It was a connection to history. And this man had lost his pocket watch in the sawdust in the ice house. Should be easy to find, except for all the sawdust. And they raked and chased down each of the corners, different men taking turns looking through every square foot, every square inch of this ice house, no watch. They'd break for lunch, and the child watching asked, what happened? And so the man who lost his watch explained, I've lost my special pocket watch, and I cannot find it. And he was clearly distraught. The child wanted to help. So the child nodded his head in understanding, went to the ice house, and closed the door. And about 3 minutes later, came back with the watch. Here you go. And they were amazed. How did you find this watch? The 5 of us, were looking carefully for this watch. We know what the value is. You're just a kid. How can you know how important it is? That couldn't have been your motivation. How did you find something that we didn't? He said, it was easy. I went inside, found a spot right there where I could lay down. I closed the door. I laid down. And then I was quiet. And before long, I could hear the ticking, tick, tick, tick. So I knew where to look. So he looked, found the watch, and was able to locate it for the man. Finding something that has value, discovering it again, is a joy, isn't it? Let's take a look at Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, verses 8 through 10. There are many parables in this chapter about lost things. Verse 8, or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the piece that I have lost. Likewise, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God when one sinner repents. It's been found. Walk in the way, and you will find something dear. What is that? And that is rest for your souls. Rest for your souls. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew 18, we'll read verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Verse 30, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Isn't it a burden to be resting today? Do you feel burdened not doing your normal chores today? Is it a burden not having to address each of those emails that buzz the device every time they come in demanding attention? Or does it feel good to be able to rest on these days, on the holy days, while everyone else is scurrying to do their shopping at the end of December? Isn't it nice to not have to go to the mall, to avoid that zoo? What rest for your souls. And you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not walk in it. Well, that's what Jeremiah said. So Israel had gone into captivity. Jeremiah is warning Judah, you need to repent. You need to amend your ways. Walk in the path. And they said, we will not walk in it. Isn't it a relief to live in a country where it's not like this? So much has changed, hasn't it? About the time my grandfather was telling me about walking down the road that led to the town of Romance, already there were petitions in the courts to get rid of prayer in schools. We can't have prayer in schools, can we? And in the 40s it picked up steam, and finally in the 60s there were official rulings that became precedent to disallow prayer at schools. Now you can't have prayer not only at the beginning of school, and I remember, by the way, in my school in Ontario, Canada, we said the Lord's Prayer. Most of the kids had no idea what it meant, but we still said it. No more. As of, I think, 1992, or was it 89, there was a court ruling that prevented that in Ontario. So all across Western nations, this is forbidden. Now the UK, they still allow it. Schools are allowed, and in some cases, required to have a prayer in the morning before school starts. Those poor children having to realize there's something bigger than themselves, that there's accountability. We will not walk in it. Christian businesses are challenged on their beliefs, sued. Some win, some lose. And those who lose generally just fold up business. It's not worth it. I will not compromise my convictions. And good for them, I say, for standing up for their Christian beliefs and refusing to engage in supporting lifestyles that they cannot condone. Which is different than condemning the sinner, isn't it? And what about the drive to change currency? Change our currency. See, do I have any? Yes, I do. E pluribus unum. In God we trust. And you've heard, I'm sure, of the desire by some to get rid of those words off of our currency. I'm offended to have to use them. Bring a checkbook. That's not the point. In God we trust. How offensive. Do you know how long ago that was actually put on currency, coin currency? Turn of the century? No. 1890s? No. 80s? 1865. Is that correct? Do I have agreement on that? Somewhere in there, 1865. Yes, we will put on our currency, in God we trust. This goes back a long time. Some who deny that the United States was ever a Christian nation, or at least a godly nation, or God-fearing nation, certainly hasn't done much history work, have they? 1865. In God we trust. No, 1865 was when the fourth stanza for the Star-Spangled Banner was written, and that's where they got the term. Thank you. In God we trust. So the Star-Spangled Banner doesn't have one verse, it has 4 verses, and the 4th verse talks about in God we trust. And that's where that came to currency. One nation under God. When was the last time you saw the clip, maybe it was online, of Red Skelton talking about the Pledge of Allegiance and saying, wouldn't it be a shame if someday we weren't allowed to say this anymore because it was considered a prayer? Now, some at the time would have laughed at him. He was a comedian after all, but he wasn't being funny in this case, was he? He was being prophetic. He knew where things were headed. But you said, we will not walk in it. It seems rather much a parallel to me to life on this continent, in Canada and the United States, seeing the decline first of the small farming communities, then the larger ones. How many towns do you drive through now and find more buildings than they can economically support? How many buildings are boarded up? Businesses, homes. And not just small towns, medium-sized towns, cities. that describes a huge and significant portion of the city of Detroit, doesn't it? What used to be such an economic powerhouse has faded so far. So it's not just small towns that are affected, cities and the nation itself, or nations themselves. So clearly this passage does have relevance for Western nations, and as they continue to move farther away, and proudly so, vigorously so, moving away, we know that God's patience, how much is it tested on a daily basis? I marvel at how patient he is. At some point it will run out. And nations including the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia are going to feel God's wrath in the same way that Israel did, the same way that Judah did. We will also feel it. Thankfully, that's not the end of the story. Let's take a look at Micah chapter 4. Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, Come and let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war any more. But every one shall sit under his vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. So I look forward to this time. I grew up in the city and really enjoyed our visits every second year, every year, to go back to the family farm and to learn what a chicken looks like with its clothes on. And to learn that eggs, when they're made, aren't as clean as they are in the store. It requires a little bit of work to get them that way. And to learn how good a turnip can be fresh out of the ground, especially when your grandpa is peeling it and washing it and giving you a slice. That to me was very idyllic. And I always enjoy going back and enjoy that setting very much. And I look forward to a time where everyone will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, where family farms and acreages flourish again. And then as they flourish, the communities that serve them flourish, and the roads that link them together will again be used meaningfully. Most importantly, the roads that link communities like Romance, where Grandpa went to school, those roads will link together and lead to the mountain of the Lord.